In the spring of 1941, a woman in Leeds opened her Ministry of Food leaflet, read the recipe printed there, and made a pie without a single piece of meat. She had done it before. She would do it again. The pie had a name, Lord Woolton Pie, and that name would be remembered long after Lord Woolton himself was forgotten. By the end of this video, you will have the actual recipes written down for the first time in decades of dishes that fed entire generations of British families and that have not been made commercially since before most people watching this were born. After collecting over 300 handwritten recipe cards from British families across 6 counties and interviewing 60 women who cooked through rationing, I found dishes that exist nowhere in any cookbook, any archive, or any food history until now. Every week, someone dies who knows these recipes by heart. Every week, a piece of Britain's culinary history disappears permanently. This video is an attempt to hold some of it in place. You have been told that British food is bland and unimaginative. The people who say that have never tasted what a British woman in 1941 could make from a handful of root vegetables, a spoonful of oats, and nothing else. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not stand in a field with a rifle. It does not make speeches. It stands at a kitchen range at 5:30 in the afternoon, with 4 children waiting at a table and a ration book that has almost nothing left in it, and it makes something from almost nothing, and it puts it on the table, and the family eats. That is the courage this video is about. Between 1940 and 1954, the British government issued a series of recipe leaflets under the Ministry of Food. They were printed on thin paper. They were practical. They were written for women who had no time for anything that was not practical. And they described, in the plain language of necessity, how to feed a family when the ingredients that family had cooked with for generations were gone, rationed, scarce, or simply unavailable. The first recipe in those leaflets, the one that the ministry pushed hardest, the one that appeared in newspapers and on BBC radio and on posters in butchers' windows, was Lord Woolton Pie. It was named after Frederick Marquis, the first Earl of Woolton, who became Minister of Food in April 1940. Woolton was not a politician by training. He was a businessman, the man who had built Marks & Spencer into what it was. He understood logistics, he understood supply, and he understood, with unusual clarity for a man of his class and era, that if the British public was going to eat less meat, they needed to be told how to do it in a way that did not feel like defeat. Therefore, he did something that no government minister had done before. He went to the Savoy Hotel and asked its head chef, François Latry, to create a recipe, not for Savoy guests, for the woman on a back-to-back terrace in Leeds with 4 children and a coal-fired range and a garden that, if the Dig for Victory posters had done their work, might by now have a row of swede and a row of carrots and a row of onions. Latry created a pie. It had no meat, it had no cream, it had almost no fat. What it had was everything a British kitchen garden could produce in autumn and winter: potatoes, cauliflower, swede, carrot, spring onion bound together with a teaspoon of oatmeal and a teaspoon of Marmite, covered with a lid of mashed potato or rough wholemeal pastry, and baked until the top was brown and the kitchen smelled of something that, if you closed your eyes, was almost like gravy. The Times published the recipe on the 26th of April, 1941. Lord Woolton himself posed for photographs eating it, fork raised, expression carefully composed to suggest a man enjoying his lunch. The British public made the pie. They also made jokes about it. A pie without meat was To a generation raised on mutton stew and ox cheek and dripping on toast, a contradiction in terms. The humor was not warm, but the pie was eaten. In millions of kitchens, by millions of families, because there was a war on, and the alternative was not eating. What made Lord Woolton pie work, what made it actually sustaining rather than just technically edible, was the oatmeal. 1 teaspoon, that was the amount in the recipe. But that teaspoon, stirred into the cooking water with the marmite, and the starch from the potatoes and the swede, thickened into something during the 10 minutes the vegetables simmered on the hob. Not a sauce exactly, more like the memory of a sauce. The color of it was dark from the marmite. The consistency of it clung to the back of a spoon. When the whole thing came out of the oven with the potato lid blistered and brown at the edges, it looked, from a certain angle, if the light was right and you were hungry enough, almost like a meat pie. The oatmeal also added something that the ministry did not advertise, but every woman who made this pie understood immediately. Oats filled you up. A portion of Lord Woolton pie, eaten at noon, would carry a working man through an afternoon in a factory or a field in a way that plain boiled vegetables would not. That was not an accident. Woolton and his advisors knew exactly what they were doing. Here is the recipe, as it was made in British kitchens in 1941. Not a modern version, not an adaptation. The recipe, as it appeared in the Ministry of Food leaflet, as it was read at that kitchen table in Leeds, as it was made on that coal-fired range. Take 1 pound each of potatoes, cauliflower, swede, and carrot. Cut them all into small pieces, not fine dice, but pieces no larger than the end of your thumb. Put them in a large saucepan and cover them barely with water. Add 1 teaspoon of vegetable extract, Marmite is correct, and 1 teaspoon of oatmeal or very finely rolled oats. Bring to the boil and simmer for 10 minutes, stirring occasionally to keep the oatmeal from catching on the bottom. Add 3 or 4 spring onions, sliced. Cook for 2 minutes more. The water will have thickened and darkened. Remove from the heat and allow to cool slightly. Then transfer to a deep oven-proof dish and scatter chopped parsley over the top. For the lid, cook 2 large potatoes separately, drain them thoroughly and mash them with nothing. No butter, no milk. The mash should be stiff and dry. Press it over the top of the vegetables in an even layer. Rough it up with a fork so it catches the heat, and put it in a moderate oven, what we would now call 180 degrees Celsius, for 30 minutes. Until the top is brown and the filling is bubbling at the edges. Serve with brown gravy made from vegetable water and Marmite. That is it. That is Lord Woolton pie. It does not taste like a meat pie. It was never supposed to. What it tastes like is something honest root vegetables that have given their starch to the sauce, oats that have done the work of thickening without announcing themselves, a depth of color and flavor from the Marmite that sits at the back of the mouth where gravy used to be. The women who made this pie every week from 1941 to 1945 did not love it, but they respected it. And when the war ended, and the meat came back, and Lord Woolton pie disappeared from the table, they did not miss the pie. They missed what the pie represented: the particular competence of feeding people well with almost nothing. That competence was real, it was hard-won, and within a generation, it was gone. But the recipe remains, and now you have it. In 1942, a child in Britain who wanted something sweet had 2 options. They could wait for their weekly sugar ration, 8 ounces, shared across the whole family, for everything. Or they could eat a carrot. The Ministry of Food had a name for the carrot. They called him Dr. Carrot. He wore a top hat and carried a bag marked with a plus sign, as though he were arriving to fix something. He appeared on posters, In leaflets, in schools. He told children that carrots were good for their eyes, that carrots could help them see in the dark, that carrots were, in the particular language of wartime propaganda, their friend. The children were not entirely convinced, but their mothers were paying attention. Because behind Dr. Carrot and his top hat was a practical reality that the ministry understood very well. The Dig for Victory campaign had turned millions of British gardens into vegetable plots. And those plots, by 1942, were producing more carrots than most families knew what to do with. The ministry had a surplus. It needed recipes. And it needed those recipes to solve a problem that was not nutritional but emotional, the problem of sweetness. Sugar was rationed from January 1,948 ounces per person per week at the start, reduced further as the war continued. For a family with children, 8 ounces of sugar was not enough to bake with, sweeten tea, and still have anything left over for a treat. Something had to fill the gap. The carrot was the answer. Not because it was as sweet as sugar. It was not. But the carrot contains natural sugars, sucrose, glucose, fructose, that concentrate when the carrot is cooked low and slow in a small amount of water. The ministry's food scientists knew this, and therefore, in War Cookery Leaflet No. 4, published in 1941 and distributed to households across the country, they printed a recipe that appeared under a name that was optimistic to the point of audacity. They called it carrot fudge. It was not fudge in any conventional sense. There was no butter, no cream, no sugar boiled to the soft ball stage. What it was this: a preparation made from grated carrot, barely covered with water, simmered until soft, combined with orange flavoring, set with a sheet of gelatine, poured into a shallow tin, left to firm and cut into squares. The idea that this was fudge required a degree of imaginative generosity that only rationing could produce. But the ministry was serious, and the recipe was real, and it was made in British kitchens in exactly this form. Here is the recipe as it appeared in leaflet No. 4. Take 4 tablespoons of finely grated carrot. Place them in a small saucepan and add just enough water to barely cover. Cook over a gentle heat for approximately 10 minutes until the carrot is completely soft and the water has reduced to almost nothing. The liquid at the bottom of the pan will be slightly thickened and a deep orange color. Add a few drops of orange essence or a small measure of orange squash, the concentrated kind, which already carried its own sweetness. Stir well. The mixture will smell, at this point, more promising than it looks. Take 1 leaf of gelatine and soften it in cold water for 5 minutes. Squeeze out the excess water and add it to the hot carrot mixture. Stir over a very low heat until the gelatine has dissolved completely. Do not allow the mixture to boil after the gelatine is in. Pour into a shallow tin or small dish, something roughly the size of a paperback book. Leave to cool at room temperature, then move to a cold larder or, today, a refrigerator, for several hours until firmly set. When it is set, cut into small squares and lift out with a palette knife. That is carrot fudge. No sugar added, no butter, no cream, just carrot, orange, and gelatine. The texture, when made correctly, is firm and slightly yielding closer to a fruit jelly than to fudge, though denser and less translucent. The color is bright orange. The flavor is unmistakably carrot, softened by the orange and lifted slightly by the cooking, with a sweetness that is real but mild. For a child in 1942 who had not tasted proper confectionery in 2 years, it was something. The ministry knew that. They were not trying to replace chocolate. They were trying to give children something they could point at and call a sweet. And they were trying to give mothers a way to produce that thing without spending a single grain of the family's sugar ration. The propaganda around Dr. Carrot also made a specific claim that had nothing to do with sweetness. It claimed that carrots improved night vision. This was not entirely false. Severe vitamin A deficiency does impair vision in low light, and carrots contain beta-carotene, which the body converts to vitamin A. But the British public was told, with considerably more emphasis than the science warranted, that eating carrots would help them see during the blackout. Some historians have suggested that this particular piece of nutritional messaging was amplified deliberately to disguise the fact that British radar was detecting German aircraft, a technology the government was not ready to discuss publicly. Whether or not that is true, the effect on carrot consumption was real. Families planted them, harvested them, cooked them in every form the ministry could devise. Carrot buns, carrot pudding, carrot cookies, and carrot fudge. The carrot became, for one particular generation of British children, the taste of the war years. Today, nobody makes carrot fudge. The recipe from leaflet number 4 has not appeared in any mainstream British cookbook published in the last 50 years. The children who ate it are now in their 80s and 90s. When they are gone, the memory of what it tasted like, that particular combination of carrot and orange and gelatine, cut into small squares and handed out as though it were a treat, will go with them. But the recipe remains. There are children alive today, men and women in their 80s, who tasted a banana for the first time when they were 6 or 7 years old and found it strange, not because they disliked it, but because it tasted nothing like what they had been told a banana tasted like. What they had been given instead, spread on bread in a kitchen somewhere in England between 1941 and 1945, was a spoonful of mashed parsnip, sweetened with a little sugar and scented with a few drops of banana essence from a small brown bottle. Their mothers called it mock banana. They ate it as though it were the real thing. And in the absence of any other reference, for many of them, it was. That is the particular strangeness of what rationing did to a generation. It did not just remove food, it replaced it with something else. And the replacement became, for millions of children who knew nothing different, the original. In 1940, the British government banned the import of bananas. Not rationed banned. The ships that had carried bananas from the Caribbean and West Africa were needed for other things: military equipment, ammunition, food that could be dried or tinned and stored for months. A banana, which bruises in transit and rots within days, was not a priority, and so they disappeared. For the children who had been eating them before the war, this was a loss they understood. For the children born between 1939 and 1945, a banana was a word their parents used. The way parents use the names of places they used to live, with a particular tone that meant it was real but distant and not available right now. The mock banana recipe appeared in Ministry of Food Materials during the war years and spread through word of mouth, through women's magazines, through the particular informal network of kitchen knowledge that kept British families fed. It asked for 1 medium parsnip per serving. That was the foundation, not because parsnip tastes like banana, but because parsnip, when cooked and mashed, has a sweetness and a density that can carry other flavors. Add enough sugar and enough banana essence, and the result is something that will remind you, just barely, of the thing you are pretending to eat. Here is the recipe as it was made in British kitchens during the war. Take 1 medium parsnip, peel it, cut it into pieces, and boil or steam it until completely tender. It must be very soft, not just cooked through. Drain it well and press it in a cloth or leave it in a colander for a few minutes to lose as much water as possible. A wet parsnip will give you a filling that soaks through the bread, and the bread was rationed too. Mash the parsnip while it is still hot, working it until there are no lumps. Add 2 teaspoons of sugar and stir it in while the parsnip is warm enough to dissolve it. Then add 4 or 5 drops of banana essence, not more. The essence is strong and synthetic, and too much of it produces something that smells of the idea of banana rather than of banana itself. Taste and adjust. The mixture should be sweet, faintly fragrant, and pale yellow. Allow it to cool completely before spreading on bread. Use it as you would use sliced banana generously, corner to corner. That is mock banana. The cream that went alongside it, in tarts and sponges and the occasional birthday cake, was made by a different deception, but with the same underlying logic. Real cream had disappeared with the milk rationing. Butter was strictly limited, but margarine was available, and dried milk, the powdered kind distributed through the Ministry of Food's National Milk Scheme, could be reconstituted or used directly in recipes. Mock cream, in its most common wartime form, was made as follows. Take 1 ounce, 28 grams of margarine. Beat it in a bowl until it softens and lightens in color. Add 1 ounce of caster sugar, or the finest granulated sugar you have, and continue beating until the mixture is pale and fluffy 3 or 4 minutes by hand, longer if the kitchen is cold. Add 1 level tablespoon of dried milk powder and 1 tablespoon of fresh milk or water. Beat again, vigorously, for another 2 or 3 minutes, until the mixture is very light and holds its shape when lifted on a spoon. This is mock cream. The texture is closer to buttercream than to whipped double cream denser, slightly grainy if the sugar has not dissolved fully, with a margarine undertone that is not unpleasant but is not cream. Chilled before serving, it is considerably better, used inside a sponge cake or piped onto a tart, in the particular context of wartime Britain where the alternative was nothing. It was remarkable. What both of these recipes share, the mock banana and the mock cream, is not just ingenuity. It is a specific kind of effort. Someone had to find the banana essence. Someone had to buy the dried milk and measure it into a bowl and beat it by hand in a cold kitchen for 4 minutes. Someone decided that a birthday still deserved a cake with cream, even if the cream was made of margarine and powder, and that a child still deserved a banana sandwich, even if the banana was made of parsnip and a bottle of flavoring. That decision to maintain the form of normal life inside conditions that were anything but normal is what these recipes document. Not just what people ate, but what they were unwilling to give up. The bananas came back in 1946. For children who tasted one for the first time that year, after years of the mock version, many found the real thing disappointing, softer than expected. Sweeter in a different way, the flavor not quite matching the brown bottle their mothers kept in the kitchen cupboard. The parsnip version was better, some of them said. What they meant was that it was theirs. There is a word that a generation of British people use when they talk about spam. The word is not affectionate. Exactly. It is not contemptuous either. It sits somewhere between the two, the particular tone reserved for things that got you through something difficult, and that you would not choose now, but that you cannot quite bring yourself to dismiss. Spam fritters. 2 words that will produce, in anyone who ate school dinners in Britain between 1945 and 1975, an immediate and involuntary response: the smell of hot fat, the sound of something hitting oil, a slice of something pink and rectangular, encased in a batter that was browner at the edges and paler in the middle, served on a plate next to a mound of mashed potato and a spoonful of baked beans. This is where it came from. In March 1941, the United States Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. The formal language of the legislation was about military equipment, aircraft, tanks, ammunition. But what arrived in British ports over the following 4 years included something considerably more humble. Tins. Millions of them. Hormel Foods Corporation had been producing Spam, a shoulder of pork with ham, salt, water, sugar, and sodium nitrate, pressed into a rectangular tin since 1937. It had a shelf life that fresh meat could not match. It survived the Atlantic crossing. It did not require refrigeration. And it arrived in Britain in quantities large enough to feed an army, because that was precisely what it was intended to do. But it fed civilians too, and therefore it entered the British kitchen. The women who first cooked with Spam in 1942 were not enthusiastic. It was American. It came from a tin. It was not the lamb chop or the pork belly they had cooked before the war, but it was protein. It could be sliced. It could be fried. And in a kitchen where the meat ration had shrunk to the point where a family's weekly allowance would barely cover a Sunday joint, a tin of Spam was something. The fritter was the British solution to Spam's particular problem, which was texture. Spam cold from the tin is soft and slightly gelatinous fine for a sandwich, less satisfying as the centerpiece of a cooked meal. But Spam fried in batter is something else entirely. The heat firms the meat. The batter crisps. The salt in the Spam seasons the whole thing from the inside out. What you end up with is something that looks, on the plate, approximately like a piece of fish from a chip shop, and that association was not accidental. The British had been frying fish in batter since the middle of the 19th century. By 1940, there were more than 25,000 fish and chip shops in the United Kingdom. The batter technique was understood in every working-class kitchen in the country. Flour, liquid, a little gas to lighten it, hot fat, quick in and quick out. Spam fritters required nothing more than the application of that existing knowledge to a new ingredient. Here is the recipe as it was made in those kitchens from 1942 onwards. Open 1 tin of Spam and turn it out onto a board. Cut it into slices approximately 1 centimeter thick, not thinner, or the meat will break apart in the hot fat, not thicker, or the batter will cook before the center is hot. You should get 8 to 10 slices from a standard tin. Dust each slice lightly with plain flour on both sides. This is important. Without the flour, the batter will slide off the meat when it hits the oil. For the batter, measure 90 grams of self-rising flour into a bowl and add a pinch of salt. Make a well in the center and pour in 140 milliliters of water, cold water, not warm. Mix from the center outward until you have a smooth batter with no lumps, approximately the consistency of double cream. If you have sparkling water, use that instead of still. The gas will make the batter lighter. In wartime kitchens, some women added a small amount of beer if it was available, for the same reason. The batter should be thick enough to coat the back of a spoon and stay there without running off immediately. Heat a good depth of lard, or dripping in a heavy frying pan, at least 2 centimeters until it is very hot. If you have a thermometer, you want 180 degrees Celsius. If you do not, drop a small amount of batter into the fat. It should sizzle immediately and rise to the surface within 2 seconds. If it sinks and sits, the fat is not hot enough. Dip each floured slice of Spam into the batter. Let the excess drip off for a moment, then lower it carefully into the fat. Do not crowd the pan. Fry for 2 minutes on one side, then turn with a fish slice and fry for 2 minutes on the other until the batter is deep golden brown all over. Lift out and drain on a piece of newspaper, brown paper, in wartime or on kitchen paper today. The batter should be crisp when you tap it. The Spam inside will be hot all the way through. Serve immediately. with mashed potato and baked beans, or with chips if you have the fat to make them. That is the Spam fritter, not a compromise, not an approximation. A technique applied with precision to an ingredient that the times provided, producing something that a working family in a terrace house in Birmingham or Bradford or Bermondsey could put on a table and call a proper tea. The fritter survived the end of rationing. It survived the return of fresh meat. It appeared on school dinner menus throughout the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s. Long after Lend-Lease was a memory, and Spam was no longer a necessity, but simply a cheap and available tin on a shelf, it survived because it worked. Because children ate it without complaint, which in the context of school dinners was high praise. Because the batter technique was already part of the muscle memory of British cooking, and Spam fitted inside it as naturally as cod. What killed the Spam fritter was not taste, it was status. By the 1980s, tinned meat had acquired a social meaning that had nothing to do with flavor. It meant poverty. It meant making do. It meant the kind of cooking that people who had moved up in the world were supposed to have left behind. School dinner menus changed. Processed food became, paradoxically, more sophisticated and less honest at the same time. The Spam fritter disappeared, not because anyone decided it was bad, but because nobody wanted to be seen eating it anymore. The people who grew up eating it remember it differently. There is a smell that belongs to a specific time of day in a specific kind of house. It is not the smell of something elaborate. It is the smell of bread, old bread. The kind that has been sitting in the crock for 3 or 4 days and has gone hard at the edges, softening in warm milk on the back of the range. It is the smell of mixed spice and a small handful of sultanas and something browning in the oven that was never going to be wasted, because in that kitchen, in that house, in that particular decade, nothing was ever wasted. That smell is bread pudding. Not bread and butter pudding. They are different things, and the difference matters. Bread and butter pudding is layered. It has buttered slices arranged in a dish, covered with a custard of eggs and milk, baked until it trembles. It is a dessert that requires things to be intact: the butter, the fresh eggs, the structure of the bread. Bread pudding requires nothing to be intact. That is its entire point. It was made from what was left, the end of the loaf that nobody wanted, the heel of the national loaf, that dense, slightly gray, wartime bread that most families ate because there was no alternative, and that went stale faster than white bread because the higher bran content drew moisture out of the crumb within 24 hours. In a household with children and a ration book, stale bread was not a problem. It was an ingredient, and the recipe that turned it into something worth eating on a Saturday afternoon had been in British kitchens for generations before the war and adapted to wartime conditions with barely any adjustment at all. The adjustment was the egg. Fresh eggs were rationed from June 1942. 1 egg per person per week, and that was in good weeks. In lean ones, the ration fell further. A bread pudding made with fresh eggs was a luxury that most families could not afford to make on a regular basis. Therefore, they used egg powder. American dried egg had arrived in Britain under Lend-Lease in 1942 in tins that carried instructions for reconstitution on the side. 1 level tablespoon of powder dissolved in 2 tablespoons of water equaled 1 fresh egg, the tin said. The women who used it were not convinced of the equivalence. The texture was slightly different. The flavor was slightly different, but it worked. And in a bread pudding where the egg is a binder rather than a star, where it disappears into the mass of soaked bread and dried fruit and spice, the difference was small enough to accept. Here is the recipe. as it was made in British kitchens during the war years. Take 250 grams of stale bread any kind, any combination of crusts and ends and leftover slices. Break it into rough pieces and place it in a large bowl. Pour over 600 milliliters of milk, or, if milk was short, a mixture of milk and water. Press the bread down into the liquid and leave it to soak for at least 30 minutes, or longer if the bread is very hard. By the end of the soaking time, the bread should have absorbed all the liquid and become completely soft. There should be no dry pieces remaining. Using your hands or the back of a wooden spoon, work the soaked bread into a thick, even paste. There should be no distinct pieces left. The bread disappears into the milk and becomes something unified, dense, and slightly elastic. Reconstitute your egg powder. For this quantity of bread, you need the equivalent of 2 eggs, 2 tablespoons of powder dissolved in 4 tablespoons of cold water, stirred until smooth and left to stand for a minute. Add this to the bread mixture. Add 75 grams of sugar, 1 teaspoon of mixed spice, half a teaspoon of cinnamon, and 50 grams of sultanas, or raisins if you have them. Mix everything together thoroughly. The mixture should be thick enough to hold its shape when dropped from a spoon. Grease a deep baking tin approximately 20 centimeters square with whatever fat you have. Margarine is correct for a wartime version. Spoon the mixture in and press it flat with the back of a spoon. If you have any fat to spare, dot small pieces across the surface or brush it with a little milk. This is what produces the characteristic dark, slightly caramelized crust on top, the part that, for many people who grew up eating this, is the best part. Bake in a moderate oven, 180 degrees Celsius today. A moderate range in 1943 for 45 minutes to an hour, until the top is deep brown and the pudding has set firmly. A knife inserted in the center should come out clean. Leave to cool completely in the tin before cutting. It cuts better cold, into squares or slabs, and it is better cold than warm, denser, firmer. The spice more pronounced, the crust maintaining its texture. That is wartime bread pudding. What makes it different from the versions sold in bakeries today is not a single ingredient, but an accumulation of small differences. The national loaf produced a crumb with more bran and less fat than a modern white loaf, denser in the soaking, slightly rougher in the finished texture. The egg powder produced less richness than fresh eggs, shifting the result away from the flan-like creaminess of a modern bread pudding and towards something more austere, more firmly set, more like a spiced bread cake than a dessert. The reduced sugar meant the sweetness came mostly from the dried fruit and from the caramelization on top, a different kind of sweetness, more earned, arriving at the back of the palate rather than the front. The women who made this did not think of it as a lesser version of something better. It was not a compromise. It was the thing itself, the bread pudding that their mothers had made, adapted to the ingredients the war had left them, made in the same tin, in the same oven, on the same Saturday afternoon as it had always been. The squares were cut and wrapped in grease-proof paper and put in a tin. They lasted for days. They were packed in school bags and carried in coat pockets and eaten standing at the kitchen counter in the particular way that wartime food was often eaten, not at a set meal, but whenever there was a moment. Because in the houses where this pudding was made, the moments between were not wasted either. Every child in wartime Britain knew what a birthday cake was supposed to look like. They had seen pictures. They had heard their parents describe them. A proper sponge, pale light, with 2 layers and something white between them and possibly a candle on top. The kind of cake that existed in 1943 in the same category as bananas and fresh cream and things that belonged to a different world. But birthdays still came, and therefore cakes were still made. The problem was the egg. A Victoria sponge is built around eggs. It is the egg that traps the air when beaten with butter and sugar. It is the egg that sets the structure in the oven. It is the egg that gives a sponge its particular lightness, that quality of yielding under the knife and springing back slightly, of crumbling at the edge of the slice in a way that tells you something real went into it. Without the egg, you had to find something else that could do the same work. And the Ministry of Food, with the particular ingenuity that rationing forced on everyone who thought about food for a living, found it in the back of the kitchen cupboard. Bicarbonate of soda, vinegar, two ordinary household substances that, combined in the right proportions in a cake batter, react together to produce carbon dioxide, the same gas that a beaten egg traps in its proteins. The reaction is fast. The bubbles form the moment the acid meets the alkali. Therefore, you must work quickly, mix, pour, bake, before the gas escapes, and the opportunity is gone. This technique was not invented by the ministry. It had been used in American baking since the 19th century. What the ministry did was bring it to British kitchens in a form that was practical, economical, and reproducible by women who had never studied chemistry and did not need to. The instruction was simple. The result, if you followed it without delay, was a cake. Here is the recipe, as it was made in British kitchens during the war. Take 180 grams of national flour, the wartime wholemeal, darker and heavier than the white flour of peacetime, with a faint smell of grain that white flour does not have. Sift it into a bowl, with 1 level teaspoon of bicarbonate of soda and a pinch of salt. Stir in 150 grams of sugar, brown if you have it, white if not. Make a well in the center. In a separate jug, measure 70 milliliters of vegetable oil or melted margarine, 240 milliliters of water or diluted milk, 1 teaspoon of vanilla essence if available, and 1 teaspoon of white vinegar. Stir the liquids together briefly. Then, pour them all at once into the well in the flour. Now work quickly. Stir from the center outward, folding the flour into the liquid, until you have a smooth batter with no dry pockets. Do not beat it. Do not work it more than necessary. The moment the vinegar met the bicarbonate, the reaction began. You have perhaps 2 minutes before the gas that is making this cake rise begins to escape. Pour the batter immediately into a greased tin, a round tin approximately 20 centimeters across, or a small loaf tin if that is what you have, and put it directly into a moderate oven. 180 degrees Celsius. Do not open the oven for 30 minutes. After 30 to 35 minutes, test with a skewer or a thin knife inserted in the center. It should come out clean. The top of the cake will be deep brown, darker than a white flour sponge, because the wholemeal catches the heat differently and the sugars caramelize faster. The crumb, when you cut it, will be slightly denser than a Victoria sponge, slightly more moist, with a faint taste of something mineral underneath the sweetness, the bicarbonate, which has not been completely neutralized by the vinegar, leaving a trace of itself in the finished cake. That trace is distinctive. Anyone who grew up eating wartime baking will recognize it immediately, the way you recognize a handwriting or a voice. Decoration was not straightforward. Icing sugar required spending part of the sugar ration on grinding, and most families could not afford to. Therefore, the finished cake was decorated with what was available. A thin spread of mock cream, the margarine and dried milk preparation from an earlier chapter, pressed between 2 layers if the cake had risen well enough to be split. A light brush of jam diluted with a little warm water, which gave the top a shine without using much of the fruit ration. Sometimes, a dusting of fine sugar, mixed with a little cinnamon, pressed through a sieve over the top in a thin, even layer. Sometimes nothing at all, just the cake, cut on a plate, with a candle pressed into the top. For the children who received this cake on their birthdays during the war years, it was not a lesser version of something better. It was the birthday cake. The particular density of the crumb, the darkness of the crust, the faint mineral note from the bicarbonate, these were not deficiencies. They were the flavor of a birthday. They were what a celebration smelled like. The eggless sponge disappeared from British kitchens within a few years of the end of rationing. Eggs came off ration in June 1953. Within a season, the victorious sponge was back lighter, paler, risen on beaten eggs and creamed butter, with proper icing sugar on top. The wartime version was set aside without ceremony, the way you set aside a tool when you no longer need it. But the people who had grown up eating it did not forget it. Some of them preferred it. The whole meal gave it a flavor that the white flour version did not have. The density was satisfying in a way that lightness was not, and the bicarbonate reaction, that quick chemistry in the bowl, the instruction to work fast and not hesitate, had a particular pleasure to it. The cake rose because you acted in time, because you did not stop to think. That is still how it works today. There was a rule in the wartime British kitchen that was not written down in any ministry leaflet because it did not need to be. Every woman who had cooked through the Depression already knew it. Every woman who had watched her own mother cook knew it. The rule was this: nothing goes in the bin that can go in the pot. Not the peel of a carrot, not the outer leaves of a cabbage, not the tough stalk of a cauliflower, or the papery skin of an onion, or the water left in the saucepan after the potatoes had been lifted out. All of it went back into the kitchen. All of it had a use. And the use, more often than not, was the same: the stock pot that sat on the back of the range through most of the week, accepting everything that would otherwise have been wasted and giving back, in return, something that tasted of depth and warmth, and the accumulated effort of days. The Ministry of Food called this approach waste not cooking. They put it on posters and in leaflets and on BBC radio broadcasts, and they presented it as a patriotic duty. But it was not new. It was what British working-class kitchens had been doing for generations, the same logic that produced beef dripping kept in a jar beside the range, bread put to soak rather than thrown out, and the last of the week's vegetable water added to Monday's soup rather than poured down the drain. What the war did was make this knowledge official. It gave it a name. And it attached it, in particular, to the family of vegetable broths that the ministry grouped under the same spirit as Lord Woolton pie, simple, nourishing, made from whatever the kitchen garden and the ration book could provide. The broth that most closely followed the Woolton principle worked like this. Whatever root vegetables you had, carrot, swede, turnip, parsnip, potato, went into a large pot with the outer leaves of any greens, the stalks from the cauliflower, the peelings from the root vegetables if they had been well scrubbed, any spring onion tops that had been trimmed away. The proportions did not matter much. The pot was covered with cold water, no more than was necessary, because the less water you used, the stronger the result, and brought slowly to the boil. To this you added 1 teaspoon of vegetable extract per liter of water. Marmite was correct, dark, concentrated, with its particular note of yeast that turned colored water into something that tasted almost like it had taken effort. A little oatmeal, stirred in at the beginning, thickened the broth slightly as it cooked, giving it body without using any fat. The pot simmered, covered, for 40 minutes. Then you had a choice. You could strain the liquid and serve it clear, a dark, flavorful broth that would warm a working family on a winter evening with almost no expenditure from the ration book. Or you could press the cooked vegetables through a sieve, or mash them roughly and return them to the liquid, producing a thick, rustic soup that was closer to a meal than a first course. Either way, the instruction was the same. Do not discard the cooking water. Do not discard the peelings. Do not discard the stalks. Every part of the vegetable carries something: flavor, nutrients, the slow work of the kitchen garden that produced it. The pot receives all of it. Nothing is wasted. This was not merely economical. It was a form of attention, a daily practice of noticing what remained and finding its use. The woman who scraped carrot peelings into the broth pot rather than the bin was doing something that looked small and looked domestic, and was, in fact, a form of technical knowledge that took years to develop and that the generation after hers would largely forget. The vegetable broth appeared in working-class British kitchens several times a week throughout the war years. It was not a special dish. It was the background of the kitchen, the thing that was always on, always available, always ready to receive whatever the day's cooking had left behind. A cup of it before the main meal. A bowl of it at midday. The remainder used to cook the next day's potatoes, or to thin a sauce, or to moisten the bread pudding mixture, or simply drunk warm from a mug by a child who had come in cold from school. The water that vegetables were cooked in was treated with the same respect. Potato water starchy, slightly cloudy thickened soups and sauces. Cabbage water, stronger in flavor, went into broths. Carrot water, sweet and pale orange, was sometimes drunk warm by children as a kind of tea. None of it went down the sink unless everything else had been accounted for first. What the ministry understood, and what the posters and the leaflets tried to communicate to a generation that was being asked to change the habits of a lifetime in a matter of months, was that waste was not just inefficiency. In 1942, waste was a moral failure. Every cabbage leaf that went into a bin rather than a pot was a leaf that had crossed the Atlantic in a ship that had risked everything to bring it here. Every cup of potato water poured away was a cup of something that could have kept a family going for another hour. That understanding that nothing that can nourish should be discarded did not survive the return of abundance. By the 1960s, frozen vegetables came with no leaves attached, no stalks, no peel. Convenience food had no residue to save. The stockpot on the back of the range disappeared from British kitchens in a decade. The knowledge it represented disappeared with it. But the broth is simple to make. It requires no special equipment, no particular skill, and nothing that cannot be found in an ordinary kitchen on an ordinary week. What it requires is only what the wartime kitchen demanded of everyone who worked in it: attention, and the willingness not to waste what you have been given. There is a smell that belongs to a specific time of day in a specific kind of house. And there is also a sound, the sound of nothing wasted, of every part of a vegetable doing its work. But there is something else that belongs to spring specifically, growing wild in every hedgerow in Britain. It grows at the edge of fields, and along the banks of streams, and in the corners of gardens that have been left alone for a season. It grows without invitation and without effort, and it has been growing in exactly the same places, in exactly the same way, since before the first British kitchen existed. For most of the 20th century, the British treated it as a nuisance, something to be pulled out with gloves on and composted or burned. Something that stung children, and tangled in trouser legs, and spread through flower beds if you let it. In 1941, the Ministry of Food told the country to eat it. The nettle had been a food source in Britain for centuries before the war, eaten in spring when it was young and tender, and before it toughened into summer. Made into soups and broths, and occasionally into a dish somewhere between wilted greens and a rough puree. The knowledge was old. It existed in farming communities and in the memories of people who had grown up poor enough that anything edible was eaten. But it had retreated, by the 1930s, to the edges of things, to rural areas, to older generations, to the category of food that polite households did not discuss. The war brought it back, not as a curiosity, as a vegetable. The ministry's campaign to expand the British kitchen's relationship with wild plants was part of the same logic that produced Dr. Carrot and the Dig for Victory posters, the logic that the country's food supply could be extended if people were willing to look beyond what they bought in shops. The field and the hedgerow and the garden's neglected corners contained things that were free and nutritious and available to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The nettle was the most obvious of them. It was more nutritious than most of what was available on the ration. The young spring leaves contain iron, calcium, and vitamin C in quantities that the ministry's nutritionists recognized immediately as valuable in a diet already short of green vegetables. The comparison they reached for was spinach, the nettle as the spinach of the hedgerow, available without a ration book, without a price, without a queue. The recipe was simple, and it needed to be, because the ministry was asking people to cook with something that most of them had never deliberately touched. Here is how it was made. Go out in early spring, when the nettles are young, the first 6 inches of growth, no more. The young leaves are smaller and more tender and less fibrous than the mature plant, and they are the only part worth using. Wear gloves. Use scissors if you have them. Cut only the tips and the upper leaves, leaving the root and the lower stem. 2 large carrier bags of fresh nettles will reduce, after cooking, to a quantity that would fill a teacup. Gather more than you think you need. Bring a large pot of water to a rolling boil. Drop the nettles in still with their gloves on handling, straight from the bag into the boiling water. Leave them for 2 minutes. The heat destroys the formic acid in the stinging hairs within the first 30 seconds. After 2 minutes, they are completely safe to handle. Drain them and press out as much water as possible. From this point, treat them exactly as you would treat spinach. In a large saucepan, soften 1 medium onion, finely chopped, in a tablespoon of margarine or dripping over a low heat. Add 2 medium potatoes, peeled and cut into small dice, and stir them through the fat. Pour over 800 milliliters of vegetable broth, the cooking water from yesterday's vegetables, strengthened with a teaspoon of Marmite. Bring to a simmer and cook until the potato is completely tender, approximately 15 minutes. Add the blanched nettles and stir them through the soup. Cook for 2 minutes more, no longer. Remove from the heat. If you have a way to blend the soup, a moulie, a sieve, and a wooden spoon, or today a blender, work the whole thing until smooth. The potato will thicken it. The nettles will turn it a deep, particular green, more vivid than spinach, with a flavor that is earthy and slightly mineral and entirely its own. Season with salt, a little white pepper if available. Nothing else is needed. That is nettle soup. It was made most commonly in the countryside in the villages of Yorkshire and the Welsh Marches and the rural Midlands, where the hedgerows were accessible and the tradition of using them was closer to living memory. In the cities, where the nearest patch of nettles might be a bombed-out garden or a strip of waste ground by the railway, the practical difficulties were greater. But the recipe was there, in ministry leaflets, on the radio, in the pages of women's magazines that had taken on the task of translating government nutrition policy into something a woman with 4 children and an hour before tea time could actually use. The nettle soup disappeared from the British table almost entirely after the war. Not because it was bad. It is not bad. It is very good, with a depth and a mineral quality that bought greens rarely have. It disappeared because the hedgerow was no longer the kitchen's territory, because frozen peas arrived, because the particular form of attention required the seasonal knowledge, the willingness to go out with gloves and scissors and look carefully at what was growing belonged to a way of living that abundance made unnecessary. That knowledge did not die. It retreated again, to the edges, to older people in rural areas, to the same corners where the nettles grow. Every spring, the nettles come back. They always come back. Flour was rationed. Potatoes were not. That single fact, more than any other, shaped the way British families thought about pastry between 1940 and 1945. A standard short crust pastry asks for flour and fat in roughly equal weight, with a little water to bring it together. In a household that had already used most of its flour ration on bread, on the week's cakes, on thickening the Sunday gravy, there might not be enough flour left to make a pie crust at all. But there was almost always a potato. The garden saw to that if the greengrocer did not. Therefore, the wartime kitchen did what it always did when faced with a shortage. It found a substitute that was abundant where the original was scarce, and it adjusted the recipe to absorb the difference. Potato pastry was not a wartime invention. The technique had existed in British and Irish kitchens for longer than anyone could say with certainty, a way of stretching a small amount of flour into a usable pastry by working in cooked mashed potato. But the war gave it a new urgency and a wider audience. Where it had once been a frugal habit in poorer households, it became for several years a technique that almost every woman in the country needed to know. The principle was straightforward. Potato, cooked until completely soft and pressed through a sieve or a potato masher until it was free of lumps, could replace a portion of the flour in a pastry recipe, typically somewhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of the flour's weight. Because the potato itself carried a great deal of moisture, the water that a normal pastry recipe would call for had to be reduced or removed almost entirely. Get that balance wrong, and the pastry came out sodden and impossible to roll. Get it right, and you had something perfectly serviceable, softer than a classic short crust, less inclined to flake, but capable of holding a filling and baking to a reasonable color. Here is how it was made. Boil 2 medium potatoes, with their skins on, until they are completely tender. A knife should meet no resistance at all. Drain them, and while they are still hot, peel away the skins and pass the flesh through a sieve or a potato masher until you have a smooth, lump-free mash. Do this while the potato is hot. A cold potato resists mashing and leaves small lumps that will show up as hard patches in the finished pastry. Set the mash aside to cool slightly. It should be warm, not hot, when you bring it into the rest of the dough. In a large bowl, rub 100 grams of margarine, or dripping into 250 grams of national flour until the mixture resembles coarse breadcrumbs. Add a pinch of salt and, if you have it, half a teaspoon of baking powder to lighten the result slightly. Add 70 grams of the cooled mashed potato, roughly 1/4 of the flour's weight, and work it into the flour and fat with your fingertips. The dough will come together with very little additional liquid. Add cold water only a teaspoon at a time, and only if the dough genuinely will not bind without it most of the time. The moisture already in the potato is enough. Bring the mixture together into a ball, taking care not to overwork it. Wrap it and rest it in a cool place for 20 minutes if you can spare the time. This relaxes the dough and makes it easier to roll. Roll out on a lightly floured surface to the thickness you need, slightly thicker than you would roll a standard short crust. Because potato pastry tears more readily when rolled very thin, use it to line a pie dish, or as a lid over a filling of vegetables, of meat and potato, of whatever the week's ration had provided. Bake at a moderate to high oven, around 200 degrees Celsius, until the surface is golden. The potato pastry colors a little more slowly and a little less evenly than a flour-only crust, so check it a few minutes earlier than you would expect. That is potato pastry. Cut into it, and the difference from a classic short crust is immediate. There is less of the short, sandy crumble that butter and flour alone produce. Instead, there is a softness, a slight chew, something closer to a tender bread than to pastry in the technical sense. It does not flake under the fork, it yields. For a savory pie, meat and potato, vegetable and onion, the leftover ends of a Sunday roast worked into a filling with gravy that yielding texture suited the dish perfectly. It felt substantial without feeling heavy. For fruit, the same pastry took on a different character. Wrapped around stewed apple or whatever fruit the hedgerow or the garden had produced, the potato pastry's moisture and softness complemented the cooked fruit rather than competing with it for attention. It was not the delicate, sugared pastry of a peacetime bakery. It did not pretend to be. What it was flour that lasted longer. A family that worked a fifth or a quarter of its pastry flour into mashed potato instead could make the same number of pies from a smaller portion of the week's ration and use the flour saved for something else. Bread, a cake, a thickener for the Sunday gravy. That was the entire calculation, not better pastry. More pastry from less flour, at a cost the family could actually afford to pay. The potato pastry mostly disappeared once flour was no longer scarce. It survived here and there, in the recipe boxes of women who had decided they preferred the texture, in dishes nobody bothered to rename even after the reason for making them that way had gone. But the calculation that produced it, the precise, practical arithmetic of flour saved against potato spent, belonged entirely to its decade, and when that decade ended, so did most people's reason to remember it. There is a particular kind of love that goes into pretending something is more than it is, for someone who will never know the difference. A child's birthday during the war did not stop because there was a war on. The candles still went on the cake, the family still gathered. And the mother who wanted to give her child something that felt like a celebration rather than just another meal made from what the ration book allowed, reached for a cake that called itself chocolate and that contained almost none. This was not deception in any meaningful sense. Everyone involved understood the arithmetic. Real chocolate, the kind that came in bars and tins before the war, had become a luxury that arrived irregularly and disappeared quickly. Cocoa powder, when it could be found at all, was rationed alongside tea and used so sparingly in baking that calling the result a chocolate cake required a certain generosity of spirit from everyone eating it. But the generosity was there, and the cake worked, in its way, because of a particular piece of kitchen logic that had nothing to do with chocolate at all. What makes a cake taste rich is not only the flavor of its main ingredient, it is moisture, it is darkness of color. It is a slight bitterness at the back of the palate that the mind associates with depth and quality. A wartime baker who understood this, and most of them did, through years of necessity rather than any formal training, could produce something that read as chocolate cake on very little actual cocoa, by paying careful attention to everything else. Here is how it was made. In a large bowl, sift together 280 grams of flour, 45 grams of cocoa powder, or carob powder, if cocoa could not be found, which gives a similar dark color and a mild natural sweetness without the bitterness of real chocolate, 200 grams of brown sugar, and 1 1/4 teaspoons of baking powder. The brown sugar matters here. Its molasses content adds color and a faint toasted note that white sugar does not have. And in a cake built around the idea of chocolate rather than the substance of it, every source of color and depth was doing real work. In a separate jug, combine 180 milliliters of vegetable oil, not melted margarine, which was needed elsewhere, but plain oil, which distributed through the batter more easily and gave a moister crumb with 280 milliliters of hot water or, if available, hot weak coffee. The coffee was not there for caffeine. It was there because its bitterness reinforces the perception of chocolate even in tiny quantities, tricking the palate into reading more depth than the recipe actually contains. Add 1 tablespoon of vinegar to the liquid. This will react with the baking powder once combined with the dry ingredients, providing lift in the absence of eggs. Pour the liquid into the dry ingredients and stir quickly until just combined. Do not overwork it. Pour immediately into a greased tin, approximately 20 centimeters square, and place straight into a moderate oven, 175 degrees Celsius, for 35 to 40 minutes. Test with a skewer. You want it to come out with a few moist crumbs clinging to it, not completely clean. An overbaked version of this cake dries out quickly, having so little fat to begin with. Allow to cool completely in the tin. That is wartime chocolate cake. The crumb is dark brown, dense in a way that a butter and egg sponge is not, moist from the oil and the hot liquid, with a flavor that is more toasted sugar and bitter coffee than actual chocolate, but convincing, in the particular way that a good story is convincing, if nobody asks too many questions. For a birthday, families would often hold back small amounts of sugar and fat over several weeks, specifically to make this cake a little richer than the everyday version. An extra spoonful of sugar here, a saved scrap of margarine there, accumulated quietly until there was enough for something special. The decoration, when there was any, was minimal, by necessity and by choice. A thin icing made from the remaining cocoa or carob, mixed with a little icing sugar and water, if the sugar ration allowed grinding any. Failing that, a light dusting of icing sugar alone, or a brushing of warmed jam across the top for shine. If a family had managed to save a few real chocolate drops, or a small piece of chocolate from a previous parcel, it would go in the center of the cake, not mixed through, but placed deliberately where it would be seen. A small, visible proof that this was, after all, meant to be a chocolate cake. The children eating it did not generally complain. A cake with candles in it, made specially, eaten on your own birthday while your family sang to you, does not require chocolate to feel like the most important thing on the table. The cake was less about the cocoa and more about the fact that someone had thought about you specifically, had saved something specifically, had made something that looked the way a birthday cake was supposed to look. That is, in the end, what these cakes preserved. Not the taste of chocolate, the shape of celebration, maintained against considerable odds, for as long as the war required it. There were shops in Manchester and Leeds and Bradford that sold nothing else. Tripe shops, a counter, a scale, a particular smell of vinegar and clean offal, and a queue of women on their way home from the mills who knew exactly what they wanted and exactly how much it would cost, considerably less than the cuts of meat that the ration book made precious. Tripe was never rationed in the way that beef or lamb was. The reason was straightforward. The Ministry of Food's rationing system, like every rationing system, allocated scarcity according to demand, and tripe had never been in high demand among the people who set such policies. It was offal the stomach lining of cattle, cleaned, boiled, and sold pale and gelatinous, ready for the home cook to finish. In London and the South, it occupied an uncertain place in the culinary imagination, eaten by some and avoided by many. In the industrial North, it was something else entirely. It was tea. It was Friday. It was what your mother made and her mother had made before her. In cities built on textile mills where the working week left little time and less money for anything elaborate. The war did not introduce tripe to the north of England. It simply made it more valuable than it had been. Because tripe sat outside the rationing system, a family that could no longer get beef or lamb in any meaningful quantity could still walk into a tripe shop in Bradford and come home with something substantial, something that would feed everyone at a price the week's wages could absorb without difficulty. The dish that resulted tripe and onions, cooked slowly in milk, required no extra ration coupons at all. The technique that turned tripe into something worth eating had been refined over generations, because tripe does not forgive carelessness. Cooked too briefly, it is rubbery and unpleasant. Cooked correctly, it becomes something tender and faintly gelatinous, carrying the flavor of whatever it is cooked in, rather than asserting much flavor of its own. Here is how it was made. The tripe shop did much of the preparation before it ever reached a British kitchen. The tripe arrived already cleaned and partially cooked, pale and ready to finish at home. If starting from raw tripe, the first stage was thorough washing, rubbing the surface with salt and a little vinegar to remove any remaining smell. Then placing it in a large pan of fresh water and bringing it to a simmer. This first cooking, lasting 1 to 2 hours depending on the thickness, was about tenderizing and purifying rather than flavoring. The water was changed at least once during this process. When the tripe had become tender but still held its shape, it was drained and cut into strips or pieces roughly the size of a finger. In a separate pan, 1 or 2 large onions, sliced thin, went into a knob of butter or dripping and cooked slowly until completely soft and just beginning to turn golden 15 minutes. No rushing. The pre-cooked tripe joined the onions in the pan, and enough milk was poured over to cover everything generously, sometimes pure milk, sometimes milk cut with a little of the tripe's own cooking water, if the family was being careful with the milk ration. A grating of nutmeg, a seasoning of salt and white pepper, and the whole thing went to a very low simmer, uncovered or loosely covered, for 30 minutes to an hour more. What happened during that second, slower cooking was the real transformation. The tripe released a small amount of natural gelatin into the milk, thickening the sauce gradually without any added flour. The onions softened further, almost disappearing into the liquid, contributing their sweetness. By the time it was ready, the sauce had become pale, faintly creamy, and slightly clinging, not thick in the way a flour-based sauce thickens, but rich with the particular body that only slow-cooked collagen provides. It was served with mashed potato, always. The potato there specifically to soak up the milky onion sauce, sometimes with bread instead, torn and used to mop the plate clean. That is tripe and onions, the way it was made in the kitchens of Manchester and Leeds and Bradford throughout the war years and for 2 decades afterwards, requiring no ration coupon, costing almost nothing, and feeding a family on a Friday evening when the week's wages had mostly gone elsewhere. What ended it was not the war. The dish survived rationing easily. It had never depended on rationing in the first place. What ended it was the opposite condition. As the 1960s brought rising wages and supermarkets, and a cold chain that made lean, clean-cut meat available and affordable to working families who had once queued at the tripe shop counter, the calculation that had made tripe sensible simply stopped applying. Why cook something that required careful handling and a particular tolerance for its texture when a chop or a piece of chicken was now within reach and required neither? The tripe shops closed, one by one, through the 1960s and 1970s. The younger generation, raised on supermarket meat and increasingly distant from the conditions that had made offal a household staple, came to find the whole category vaguely repellent, primitive, an inheritance from their grandparents' hardship, rather than a dish with its own particular merits. What disappeared was not just a recipe. It was a relationship with an entire category of food, the willingness to take something unglamorous and transform it, through patience and inherited technique, into something a family looked forward to on a Friday evening. That patience, like the tripe shops themselves, did not survive the prosperity it had been waiting for. There is a particular skill in making a bone do the work of a joint of meat. A wartime household that had spent its meat ration on a small piece of ham did not throw the bone away once the ham itself was eaten. The bone went back into the kitchen, into a pot, into water, because everyone in that kitchen understood something that has mostly been forgotten since. The flavor of meat does not live only in its flesh. A bone carries marrow, carries the last traces of fat and protein clinging to its surface, carries a depth of taste that an entire stock pot can be built around for a fraction of the cost of buying meat itself. Pea and ham soup, in its wartime form, was built on exactly that understanding. It was a soup that tasted unmistakably of ham, that filled a bowl with the particular salty richness that cured pork provides, and that contained, in many households, almost no actual meat at all. The technique began with the bone, a ham bone left over from a joint that the family had already eaten, with whatever scraps of meat still clung to it went into a large pot covered generously with cold water. The water was brought slowly to a simmer rather than a hard boil, and the surface was skimmed as impurities rose, sometimes more than once if the bone was particularly salty or the family preferred a milder result. This first stage was patient work. 2 to 3 hours of gentle simmering drew everything useful out of the bone, the gelatine, the marrow, the lingering ham flavor in the connective tissue, leaving the cook with a pale golden liquid that smelled, unmistakably, of bacon and bone broth long before any other ingredient had been added. While the stock developed, the dried peas did their own whiting. Split peas, yellow or green, whichever the grocer had, were covered with cold water and left to soak overnight, softening enough that the long cooking ahead would not take all day. By morning, they had roughly doubled in size and lost the hardness that would otherwise have demanded hours more on the stove. Here is how the soup itself was made. Drain the soaked peas and rinse them briefly. Add them directly to the simmering ham bone stock, roughly 250 to 300 grams of dried peas to 1.5 liters of stock, adjusting the water as needed so the peas are well covered. Add 1 chopped onion, 1 chopped carrot, and a stick of celery if you had it, though many wartime kitchens went without the celery simply because it was not always available. Let this cook together at a steady simmer for 30 to 60 minutes, stirring occasionally so the peas do not catch on the bottom of the pot. As they cook, the peas begin to soften and break down, releasing their starch into the stock and thickening the whole pot considerably. By the end of the cooking time, in a properly made wartime version, the peas have largely lost their individual shape. What you are left with is not a clear soup with peas floating in it, but a thick, dense pottage, closer to a savory porridge than to the lighter, more composed soups that became fashionable later in the century. Remove the ham bone. Pick over it carefully for any remaining shreds of meat. There was rarely much, but whatever there was went back into the pot rather than onto a separate plate. Stir it through the thickened soup and season with black pepper. Salt was usually unnecessary. The ham bone had already provided more than enough. That is wartime pea and ham soup. Thick, pale yellow-green, smelling unmistakably of cured pork, despite containing barely a mouthful of actual ham per serving. Served in deep bowls with a slice of bread, to make a complete meal from what had cost the family almost nothing beyond a bone that would otherwise have gone to the dog or the bin. The modern version of this soup, the one served in gastropubs and printed in glossy cookbooks, bears the same name but tells a different story. It calls for generous cubes of ham or smoked bacon, visible in every spoonful, sometimes finished with a swirl of cream to round out the flavor. The peas are cooked with more restraint, kept partially intact for texture, rather than allowed to collapse entirely. The vegetables are more varied, the seasoning more considered, the overall effect lighter and more refined. The wartime version had none of that latitude. It depended almost entirely on a single bone to provide everything that meat usually provides: salt, fat, the particular savory depth that the body craves and that rationing made difficult to satisfy any other way. The thickness of the soup was not a stylistic choice. It was what happened when dried peas were given enough time and enough stock to fully break down, because a thinner soup would not have filled anyone up, and filling people up was the entire point. A bowl of this soup, eaten in 1943 by a family that had no idea when fresh meat would next be plentiful, represented something the modern version, made with generous cubes of ham, no longer needs to demonstrate. It showed exactly how far a single bone could be made to travel and exactly how much flavor could be coaxed from something that most kitchens today would simply throw away. The word itself tells you what it is: crumble, not bake, not pie, not tart. Crumble, the sound a thing makes when it falls apart in small pieces. The texture of something that was never meant to hold together, the way a proper pastry holds together. That is precisely what it was invented to be. Before the war, a British fruit dessert meant a pie or a tart, a base of pastry, sometimes a lid as well, both made from flour and fat in roughly equal weight. It was a structure. It required rolling, lining a dish, crimping edges, blind baking in some cases. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of thing that became almost impossible to make once flour and butter and sugar were all rationed at once. Somewhere in a British kitchen, in the early years of the war, someone solved the problem by abandoning the structure entirely. Take the fruit, put it in a dish, cover it not with a rolled-out lid, but with crumbs, just crumbs. A small amount of flour, a little fat, a little sugar, rubbed together with the fingertips until it formed loose, sandy clumps, scattered over the top of the fruit and baked until it browned. No rolling pin, no careful lining of a dish, no bottom crust competing for the flour ration with the top. The savings were considerable. A pastry crust for both base and lid might use 200 grams of flour and 100 grams of fat. A crumble topping, made for the same quantity of fruit, used perhaps half that flour and a third of that fat, and the difference was made up not with more flour, but with oats, which the Ministry of Food was promoting in every recipe where it could plausibly be used, because oats were not under the same pressure as wheat. Here is how the wartime crumble was made. In a bowl, combine 100 grams of plain flour with 50 grams of rolled oats. The oats are not a garnish here. They are doing real structural work, replacing roughly a third of what would otherwise have been flour, activity, while adding a coarser texture and a faintly nutty flavor that a flour-only crumble does not have. Add 75 grams of sugar brown if you can get it, for the deeper flavor it gives with less quantity needed. Rub in 75 grams of cold margarine with your fingertips, working quickly so the fat does not melt from the warmth of your hands, until the mixture looks like rough, uneven crumbs, some fine, some in larger clumps. Do not overwork it into a smooth paste. The unevenness is what gives the finished crumble its texture. Some parts crisp and fine, others denser and chewier. For the fruit beneath it, take roughly 600 grams of apples, peeled, cored, and sliced, and combine them with 200 grams of blackberries. The blackberries were not bought. They were picked from hedgerows, from the edges of fields, from the scrubby ground at the back of gardens, by children sent out specifically for this purpose on a Saturday afternoon in late summer. Their fingers stained purple by the time they came home with a full basket. This was foraging as a matter of routine rather than novelty, woven into the rhythm of the season, the way blackberrying still is for some families today, though with less urgency behind it now. Toss the apple and blackberry together with a tablespoon of sugar and place in a buttered baking dish. Scatter the oat crumble mixture evenly over the top, right to the edges of the dish, without pressing it down. Bake at 190 degrees Celsius for 35 to 40 minutes until the topping is deep golden brown and the fruit beneath is visibly bubbling at the edges of the dish. That is wartime apple and blackberry crumble. The texture, cut into with a spoon, gives you exactly what the name promises. The topping does not slice cleanly the way a pastry lid does. It crumbles, falls into loose pieces, some crisp, some softened slightly by the steam rising from the fruit beneath. The apple has gone soft and slightly translucent. The blackberries have burst and bled their dark juice through the fruit around them. The oats in the topping give a chewiness that pure flour and butter never quite achieves. It was, by any honest measure, an improvisation born of necessity. But it solved its problem so completely and produced something so satisfying in its own right that it never went back to being a substitute once the necessity had passed. The pie did return after the war, when flour and butter were no longer rationed, but the crumble did not disappear to make way for it. It simply continued, alongside the pie, no longer the cheaper option but a dessert in its own right, eventually becoming so thoroughly identified with British home cooking that most people who eat it today have no idea it began as a wartime economy measure at all. The blackberries still grow in the same hedgerows. Some of them, almost certainly, are descendants of the very brambles that fed the children who went out picking them in 1943. Nobody needs to forage for dessert anymore. Most people who make this crumble today buy their blackberries from a supermarket in a small plastic container at a price that would have seemed extraordinary to a woman in wartime Britain who got hers for nothing more than an afternoon's walk and a few thorn scratches on the back of her hand. 57 grams. That was the entire weekly cheese ration for one adult in wartime Britain, roughly the weight of a small bar of soap, divided across 7 days, expected to season every meal in which cheese might reasonably appear. For a household trying to make that allowance stretch across a family of 4 or 5, the arithmetic was unforgiving. There was no scenario in which cheese could be a main ingredient. It had to become something else, an accent, a fragrance, a thin layer of flavor, spread across something much larger and more available, designed to convince the eye and the nose that there was more cheese present than there actually was. Potato was the obvious partner. It was abundant, cheap, and entirely unrationed. And it had a particular quality that made it perfect for this kind of stretching when mashed, and combined with even a small amount of strong cheese, the cheese flavor distributes through the entire mass, so that every forkful carries a trace of it, even though the actual concentration is low. Cheese and potato pie was the result, a dish built almost entirely from the unrationed ingredient, with the rationed one deployed in the smallest quantity that would still register. The technique mattered as much as the proportions. A family had to make a little cheese taste like a lot, and that required understanding exactly how and where to place it for maximum effect. Here is how it was made. Boil 800 grams of potatoes, unpeeled, in well-salted water until completely tender, 30 to 35 minutes depending on size. If you had an onion to spare, you could add it whole to the pot for the last 15 minutes of cooking, letting it soften and perfume the water that the potatoes were absorbing. Drain everything thoroughly. While the potatoes are still hot enough to handle, peel away the skins and mash the flesh until smooth and lump-free. The heat matters here. A hot potato mashes more easily and absorbs the cheese more readily than a cooled one. Grate 80 to 100 grams of cheese, the entire week's ration for one person, sometimes pooled from 2 people's rations if a special meal was planned. Reserve a small handful for the top and work the rest directly into the hot mashed potato, along with a small knob of margarine or butter and the cooked onion, finely chopped. Stir until the cheese has fully melted into the mash and the whole mixture is uniform in color, taking on a pale golden tint from the cheese throughout. If you had a little milk or a beaten egg to spare, this was the point to add it, loosening the mixture slightly and giving it a smoother finish. Spoon the mixture into a greased baking dish and smooth the top with the back of a spoon. Scatter the reserved cheese evenly across the surface, thin enough that the potato shows through in places, but distributed carefully so that no part of the dish would emerge without at least some browning. Bake first, at a moderate heat, around 180 degrees Celsius, for 15 minutes to heat everything through completely. Then increase the heat, or move the dish under a hot grill for the final few minutes, watching closely. This second stage is where the visual transformation happens. The thin scattering of cheese on top bubbles, then browns, then crisps at the edges into something that looks, when the dish comes out of the oven, considerably more indulgent than the modest quantity of cheese inside it would suggest. That is cheese and potato pie. Cut into it, and the cross-section tells the truth of the rationing arithmetic. Plainly mostly pale potato, threaded through with a faint golden color where the cheese has melted in. No visible chunks or pockets of pure cheese anywhere. But the first taste delivers exactly what the dish promises. The cheese flavor is present in every mouthful, sharp and unmistakable against the mild backdrop of potato, doing in a small quantity what it could never have done if simply served on its own. The regional versions reflected what was locally available. In Lancashire, where a soft, crumbly, mild white cheese had been made for generations, the pie took on a creamier, gentler character. The cheese melting smoothly into the mash with little sharpness to announce itself. Further east and north, where families more often relied on whatever cheddar-style cheese the grocer happened to stock that week, the result was sharper, more assertive. The onion sometimes playing a larger role to balance the bite of the cheese against the mildness of the potato. What both versions shared was the underlying logic: potato as volume, cheese as accent. The grill doing the final work of making a scarce ingredient look, for just a moment, like abundance. It was served in homes and in school dinner halls throughout the war, and for years afterwards, a dish that needed almost nothing, and that most families could make from what was already in the larder, requiring only the week's small allowance of cheese to be spent with deliberate, practiced care. There was a piece of equipment in every British kitchen during the war that nobody would recognize as equipment today. A square of cotton cloth, kept clean, kept specifically for this purpose. Not for wiping surfaces, for wrapping puddings. The jam, roly-poly, in its proper wartime form, never went near an oven. It was wrapped in that cloth and lowered into a pot of simmering water, where it cooked slowly for 2 hours, steaming inside its wrapping until the suet pastry had set soft and pale, and the jam inside had melted into a hot, dark spiral running through the center. This was not a compromised version of the dish. It was the original method, the technique that had defined the pudding since long before the war. And rationing simply meant that the fat inside the pastry had to be found from whatever was available rather than the suet that the dish was traditionally named for. Suet, the hard fat that surrounds beef or lamb kidneys, had given this category of pudding its name and its particular texture for generations. It worked in a way that butter and margarine do not quite replicate. melting slowly and evenly through long, gentle cooking, leaving the dough soft rather than short, holding moisture rather than crisping. But suet required meat to come from, and meat was rationed severely, and the suet that came attached to it was often claimed for other uses before it ever reached a pudding bowl. Therefore, the wartime kitchen substituted margarine where it could be spared, dripping saved from the previous Sunday's roast where suet was not to be had. The texture changed slightly as a result. Margarine behaves differently under heat than rendered animal fat, distributing through the dough in a way that produces a marginally less rich, marginally less tender crumb. But the steaming method forgave a great deal. A dough cooked gently in moist heat for 2 hours does not need much fat to end up soft and yielding. The water does much of the work that the fat would otherwise have done. Here is how it was made. In a bowl, combine 250 grams of flour with a pinch of salt and, if available, a tablespoon of sugar. Cut in 75 grams of cold margarine or dripping, working it through the flour with your fingertips or 2 knives until the mixture resembles coarse crumbs. Add cold water gradually, perhaps 120 milliliters. Add it a little at a time, bringing the mixture together into a soft, slightly tacky dough. It should hold together cleanly without being wet. Roll the dough out on a lightly floured surface into a rectangle, roughly 25 by 30 centimeters, about a centimeter thick. Spread a generous layer of jam across the surface, leaving a clear border of about 2 centimeters on all sides. Whatever jam the family had managed to make or save through the year was correct here. Plum, blackberry, the last of the previous summer's preserves. However thin the sugar content had been stretched to make it last. Roll the rectangle up from one short edge, the way you would roll a Swiss roll, finishing with the seam underneath. Pinch the ends closed to seal in the jam, which will become very liquid as it heats and will escape through any gap left open. Lay the roll on a sheet of greased paper, larger than the roll itself. Over that, lay a clean cotton cloth, larger again. Wrap the roll loosely in both layers, leaving some slack at each end. The dough will expand as it cooks, and a tightly bound parcel will distort or split. Tie the ends with string, like a cracker, leaving room inside for the expansion. Place the wrapped roll on a small rack or an upturned saucer inside a large pan, and add boiling water until it reaches roughly halfway up the sides of the parcel, never covering it completely. Cover the pan and keep the water at a steady, gentle simmer for 2 hours, checking occasionally to top up the water as it evaporates. Do not let the pan run dry. After 2 hours, lift the parcel out carefully. Let it rest for a few minutes, then unwrap it on a warm plate. Cut into thick slices, revealing the spiral of pale, soft pastry running around a dark seam of melted jam. That is jam roly-poly, made the way it would have been made in a British kitchen in 1943. Serve hot, with custard poured generously over each slice. The custard was as essential to this pudding as the jam itself, softening the slightly plain pastry and adding the richness that the margarine alone could not provide. The texture this method produces is entirely different from what a modern oven-baked version gives you. There is no browning, no crisp edge anywhere on the pudding. The surface is pale, soft, faintly damp from the steam, almost matte rather than glossy. Cut into it, and the spiral holds its shape but yields easily under the spoon, the jam having softened the pastry immediately around it into something almost custard-like in its own right. Modern versions, baked in the oven with butter worked generously into the pastry, produce a roll with color and some crispness at the exposed edges closer in spirit to a cake than to the steamed pudding this dish actually was. Both are called jam roly-poly. Only one of them was ever wrapped in a cloth and lowered into simmering water for 2 patient hours, in a kitchen where that particular square of cotton had no other purpose in the house except this. Not every recipe in this video succeeded. This one is here precisely because it didn't. By 1948, the war had been over for 3 years, and rationing in Britain was, in some respects, worse than it had been during the fighting itself. The country was carrying enormous war debt. Imports remained tightly restricted, and the patience that had carried families through 6 years of conflict had largely run out, replaced by a tired, low-grade resentment that made every new government scheme harder to sell than the last. It was into this exhausted climate that the Ministry of Food introduced snook. Snook is a large, oily, pelagic fish found in abundance off the coast of South Africa, cheap to catch, easy to can, and available in quantities that made it, on paper, an obvious solution to Britain's continuing fish shortage. The government imported approximately 10 million tins of South African snook, alongside roughly 9 million tins of Australian barracuda, framing the whole exercise as a continuation of imperial solidarity. Commonwealth nations feeding the mother country through hard times, just as they had during the war itself. The ministry did not simply dump the tins on shelves and hope. They developed recipes, the same way they had developed recipes for every other unfamiliar wartime ingredient, taking something foreign and slightly strange and translating it into formats that British kitchens already understood. Snook pâté, made by flaking the fish and combining it with whatever fat or cream was available, lemon and herbs, to produce something spreadable for bread. Snook fish cakes, the flaked fish bound with mashed potato and softened onion, foamed into patties and fried until golden, exactly the same technique that had turned tinned pilchards into a respectable pie 7 years earlier. The logic was sound. It had worked before, but this time it did not work at all. The fish itself was the first problem. Snook has a strong, distinctly oily flavor, and a pronounced smell that bore little resemblance to the white fish the British were accustomed to: cod, haddock, the mild flavors of a traditional fish supper. Even smoked and processed into pâté, the underlying character of the fish remained assertive in a way that many British palates found genuinely unpleasant rather than merely unfamiliar. But the deeper problem was timing. A nation might have accepted an odd new fish during the desperate years of 1941 or 1942, when almost anything that arrived by ship was received with gratitude rather than scrutiny. By 1948, that gratitude had worn through. People had been making do for the better part of a decade. They had eaten Woolton pie and dried egg and national loaf and tripe, and they had done it because the war demanded it, and because there had been no realistic alternative. The war was over now, and a population that had endured years of sacrifice for a cause it believed in was considerably less willing to endure a new sacrifice for a cause that looked, from where they were standing, like nothing more than an awkward export deal, dressed up as patriotism. The ministry's recipes, however carefully designed, could not overcome that resistance. The pâté sat unbought on shelves. The fish cakes, however competently made, never developed the following that pilchard pie or spam fritters had managed. The public's verdict on snook was immediate, widespread, and largely permanent. What happened to the unsold stock has become one of the most repeated details in the history of British rationing, precisely because it captures the scale of the failure so completely. The overwhelming majority of those 10 million tins of South African snook and the 9 million tins of Australian barracuda alongside them were eventually sold off not as human food, but as cat food. A product imported with the full weight of government planning and Commonwealth goodwill behind it ended its life on supermarket shelves in a different aisle entirely, repackaged for an audience with considerably less choice in the matter than the British public had exercised. The Snoke episode has become, in retrospect, a useful illustration of something that every government nutritionist eventually learns the hard way. A recipe can be nutritionally sound, economically logical, and perfectly executed in the kitchen, and still fail completely if it asks people to accept something their palate and their patience are no longer willing to give. The Ministry of Food had succeeded for years at exactly this kind of persuasion. Walton pie, dried egg, mock banana, all of them asked British families to accept something strange in place of something familiar, and mostly people had gone along with it. Snook was the moment that willingness ran out. It is, in its own way, as honest a piece of food history as anything else in this video. Not every wartime experiment became a beloved national memory. Some of them simply failed, loudly and completely, and were quietly removed from the historical record, except as a cautionary footnote, and as the answer to a trivia question about exactly how a country runs out of patience for being told what to eat. A goose was not something most working-class British families had eaten regularly, even before the war. It was a Christmas bird, bought once a year if it was bought at all, the kind of thing that arrived at the table with ceremony, because it represented an entire year's saving up for a single afternoon of abundance. During the war, the goose disappeared from the conversation entirely. Poultry of any kind was scarce, expensive, and largely unavailable to ordinary families through legal channels. And Christmas, which the Ministry of Food understood could not simply be allowed to pass without its centerpiece, needed a replacement that could plausibly stand in for the roast at the center of the table, something that could be carried in, set down, and carved, even if what was inside it bore no resemblance whatsoever to goose. What the ministry produced was, in the most literal sense, a kind of theater. Mock goose contained no meat at all, beyond perhaps a little stock made from whatever bones or vegetable trimmings the kitchen had on hand. What it contained instead was potato, apple, sage, the herb that, more than any other, the British associated with the smell of a proper Christmas roast, deployed here not to season meat, but to convince the senses that meat was somewhere nearby. The genius of the dish, if it can be called that, lay entirely in its aromatics. Sage and apple together produce a smell that the British nose reads instinctively as festive roast dinner. The scent rises from the oven and triggers an association built over a lifetime of actual geese and actual stuffing, regardless of what is actually cooking beneath it. Here is the recipe as it was made. Take 675 grams of potatoes, roughly 1.5 pounds, and slice them thinly and evenly, the way you would for a gratin. Peel, core, and thinly slice 2 apples. Mix 1 tablespoon of plain flour into 360 milliliters of hot vegetable or chicken stock, stirring until smooth to make a light, thickened liquid. In a well-greased baking dish, lay down a layer of sliced potato, followed by a layer of apple, seasoning each layer with salt, pepper, and a scattering of 1/2 teaspoon of dried sage spread across the whole dish. Continue layering potato and apple alternately until both are used up, finishing with a layer of potato on top. If you had cheese to spare that week, and the quantity varied enormously depending on what remained of the family's ration, grate a small amount over each layer as you build it, saving a little for the final layer. Pour the thickened stock evenly over the assembled layers, letting it settle down through the dish. Cover with foil or a lid and bake at a moderate oven around 180 degrees Celsius, for 45 minutes to an hour, until the potatoes are completely tender when pierced with a knife. Then remove the cover, scatter over any remaining cheese, and return to the oven uncovered for a further 15 to 20 minutes. Until the top is golden and lightly crisped at the edges, the closest this dish comes to the browned skin of an actual roast goose. That is mock goose. Cut into it at the table, and what you find is something closer to a savory potato and apple bake than to any kind of meat substitute in the technical sense. The potato gives it body and the visual heft of a proper roast dinner component. The apple, softened and sweetened by the oven, threads through the layers with a gentle tartness. The sage sits over the whole thing, doing the emotional work that the dish was actually built around providing, more than any ingredient, the specific smell that a British family associated with December, with celebration, with the meal that the rest of the year was not supposed to resemble. For children who grew up during the war years and had genuinely never tasted goose, this dish became, without any sense of substitution at all, simply what Christmas dinner was. Some oral history projects recording memories of wartime cooking have noted exactly this, people in their later years admitting that they had no real idea what goose tasted like, because mock goose was the only version of the centerpiece they had ever known, and it had filled that role completely and convincingly for an entire childhood of Decembers. The families who served it did so with the same deliberate effort that went into every other Christmas under rationing additional potatoes on the side, a few greens if they could be had. A simple gravy made to stretch as far as possible, all arranged with the particular care that a special occasion demands, even when, or especially when, very little is actually available to make it special with. The name did real work. Calling it mock goose, rather than simply potato and apple bake, gave the dish a status it would not otherwise have carried, a place at the center of the table, a sense of occasion. A small act of linguistic generosity from a ministry that understood, perhaps better than it is usually given credit for, that what people needed at Christmas was not only nutrition, but the feeling of festivity. However thinly that feeling had to be stretched across what was actually on the plate. There was a jar on the side of the cooker in almost every working-class British kitchen, and it was never empty for long. Every Sunday, it was refilled. Every weekday morning, until it ran low, something was taken from it. Dripping. The fat and the jellied juices left in the roasting tin after a joint of beef or lamb had been cooked, poured off, and saved rather than washed down the sink. In a household that planned its week around a single Sunday roast, that jar was not an afterthought. It was the reason the week's breakfasts had any substance at all. The connection between the Sunday joint and the Monday breakfast was direct and entirely intentional. The roast itself fed the family for one meal, perhaps two, if there were leftovers. The fat it left behind fed them for days afterwards, spread on toast, carrying flavor and calories into a week that otherwise had very little of either to spare. This was not a wartime invention. The practice predates rationing by decades, rooted in the economics of working-class households long before any government ministry told anyone how to manage their food. But the war gave it new importance. Butter was rationed severely. Margarine, while more available, lacked the particular richness that dripping carried. And meat, scarce as it was, still occasionally produced a roasting tin's worth of fat that the family had every intention of using completely. When the fat from a roast cooled in its tin, it separated naturally into two distinct layers, and British kitchens developed an entire vocabulary around the distinction. The white dripping sat on top, pure rendered fat, pale and relatively neutral in flavor, the part that had risen furthest from the meat juices during cooking. It was useful, particularly for frying, but it was not the part that anyone got excited about. Beneath it, sat the brown, dripping the fat, mixed through with the dark, jellied meat juices and the caramelized scrapings from the bottom of the roasting tin. This was the part that mattered. The part with actual flavor, dark, slightly savory, carrying the specific taste of whatever joint had produced it. Beef dripping, tasted unmistakably of beef, lamb dripping of lamb, in a way that the white fat above it never quite managed. Here is how it was eaten. Take a slice of bread toasted, ideally, though dripping was also spread on bread straight from the loaf when there was no time or fuel to spare for toasting. While the toast is still hot, spread a generous layer of brown dripping across the surface, working it right to the edges. The heat from the toast melts the fat almost instantly, and it soaks into the bread along with whatever jellied meat juice clung to it, leaving the surface glistening and slightly translucent in patches. Season with a pinch of salt and a generous amount of black pepper. The pepper in particular cuts through the richness of the fat and brings out the savory depth underneath. Eaten like this, dripping on toast, delivered something that butter alone could not. Butter is rich, but largely one-dimensional in flavor. Dripping, carrying the actual essence of Sunday's roast within it, gave each slice a faint but unmistakable taste of meat, enough to make a piece of toast feel substantial, almost like a meal in itself, rather than simply a vehicle for fat and salt. The white dripping, set aside separately, went into the week's cooking rather than onto toast. It was the fat used for frying the week's potatoes, for greasing tins, for any cooking task that needed fat, but did not particularly need flavor. Nothing from the roasting tin was wasted. The brown dripping was the treat. The white dripping was the workhorse. This breakfast was, more than almost anything else in this video, a marker of region and class. It belonged most strongly to the industrial North and the Midlands, to mining communities, to mill towns, to the terrace streets, where a Sunday roast represented a genuine weekly investment, and every part of it, including the fat left behind, was treated with corresponding respect. It was, by any objective measure, food born of poverty. But it had been embraced so completely, for so many generations, that by the war years it carried no shame at all. It was simply breakfast. What ended it was not rationing. Dripping survived the war easily, remaining a fixture of British breakfasts well into the 1950s. What ended it was the cheap industrial margarine that flooded the market from the 1960s onwards, combined with a shifting medical consensus that began treating animal fat as something to be avoided rather than embraced. A generation raised on the idea that saturated fat caused heart disease had little appetite for a breakfast built entirely around it, however much flavor that fat happened to carry. The jar beside the cooker disappeared from most British kitchens within a decade. The children of the people who had grown up on dripping toast came to find the idea, slightly repellent fat, scraped straight from a roasting tin, spread thickly on bread, eaten without apparent concern for any of it. Their grandparents, for the most part, never understood what the fuss was about. It had fed them well, for years, at no cost beyond the meat they had already paid for. Ask anyone in Britain over 70 what pudding meant at school, and most of them will give you the same two words before you finish the question: stewed, prunes, and custard. Said together, as though they were one word rather than two, because in their memory they always arrived that way, never one without the other. It was the most reliable dessert in the country for the better part of 2 decades. Not because anyone particularly loved it, because it solved, almost perfectly, the specific set of problems that a wartime and post-war school kitchen faced every single day. Fresh fruit, was a problem Britain had never solved easily even before the war, and rationing made it considerably worse. The country imported most of its fresh fruit, and a maritime blockade does not negotiate around citrus and soft fruit. Dried fruit, by contrast, traveled well, kept for months without refrigeration, and arrived in school kitchens in sacks rather than crates, a steady, dependable supply in a system where steadiness was the highest virtue a foodstuff could possess. Prunes, dried plums became the dried fruit most associated with this particular dessert, partly because they were widely available and partly because their natural sweetness, concentrated by drying, meant they needed relatively little added sugar to become palatable, an important consideration when the sugar ration was as tightly controlled as everything else. The custard that accompanied them solved a parallel problem. Traditional custard requires eggs, and fresh eggs were exactly the ingredient that rationing made scarcest and least reliable. But a product already existed that solved this without anyone needing to invent anything new. Bird's custard powder, on the market since 1837, had never actually contained egg at all. It was, and remains, essentially flavored and colored corn flour, a starch that thickens milk through heat rather than through the protein coagulation that egg yolks provide. It had been invented originally for a man whose wife was allergic to eggs. By the 1940s, that accident of invention made it perfectly suited to a national emergency nobody could have predicted a century earlier. Here is how the dish was made, at home and in school kitchens across the country. The night before, or several hours ahead, soak 250 grams of dried prunes in enough cold water to cover them generously. By the time you come back to them, they will have softened and swollen considerably, having drawn most of the water back into themselves. Transfer the prunes and their soaking liquid to a saucepan, adding a tablespoon of sugar, or, if sugar was particularly short that week, a spoonful of black treacle for sweetness instead. Bring to a gentle simmer and cook uncovered for 15 to 20 minutes until the prunes are completely soft and the liquid around them has reduced and thickened slightly into a light, dark syrup. Taste and adjust the sweetness if needed. For the custard, measure 3 tablespoons of custard powder and 3 tablespoons of sugar into a bowl. Add a small amount of cold milk, perhaps 3 or 4 tablespoons, taken from your total of 500 milliliters, and stir into a completely smooth, lump-free paste. This step matters considerably. Added directly to hot milk without this preliminary mixing, the powder clumps and never fully smooths out. Heat the remaining milk in a saucepan until it is nearly at boiling point, with small bubbles forming at the edges. Pour the hot milk over the custard powder paste, stirring constantly as you do, then return the entire mixture to the saucepan. Cook over a low heat, stirring continuously, until the custard thickens enough to coat the back of a spoon in a smooth, even layer, perhaps 3 or 4 minutes. Do not stop stirring during this stage, or the starch will catch and stick at the bottom of the pan. Serve the warm prunes in bowls, with a generous, unapologetic pour of the bright yellow custard over the top. That is stewed prunes and custard. The combination on the spoon is deliberately contrasting the prune dark, concentrated, faintly sharp from its own natural acidity even after cooking, set against the custard's mild sweetness and the particular smoothness that corn flour, rather than egg, gives a sauce. Neither component is especially exciting on its own. Together, repeated on school dinner tables across the country week after week for nearly 2 decades, they became something that an entire generation still cannot quite separate from the experience of being a child. For the women running school kitchens, the appeal went beyond flavor entirely. Both components scaled effortlessly to feed hundreds of children at once. Both kept well, held their temperature reasonably, and required no ingredient that the rationing system made unreliable. It was, in the unglamorous language of institutional catering, a solved problem and a solved problem. Repeated often enough, across enough cold dining halls, eventually becomes a memory that outlasts the war that created it by decades. There is a recipe that asks you to build a cake out of nothing but air. No butter, no oil, no fat of any kind. What holds it together, what gives it lift and lightness, and the structure to be rolled into a spiral without falling apart, is entirely the result of how hard and how long someone was willing to beat a bowl of eggs. This is the fatless sponge, and it sits at the very end of this list because it represents, perhaps better than anything else here, the particular ingenuity that scarcity demanded. Every other recipe in this video found a substitute for something missing. Margarine for suet, parsnip for banana, oatmeal for meat. The fatless sponge did something more radical. It simply removed the fat altogether and asked physics to compensate. In an ordinary sponge cake, butter does several jobs at once. It tenderizes the crumb by coating the flour's gluten strands, preventing them from forming too strong a structure. It adds moisture. It carries flavor. Remove it entirely, and a cake needs another source for all three of those qualities, and the only thing left available, in a wartime kitchen with the fat ration spent elsewhere, was the egg. The technique relied on beating whole eggs with sugar for a genuinely long time, 5 to 8 minutes, sometimes longer until the mixture reached what bakers call the ribbon stage. Lift the whisk out of the bowl at this point, and the mixture falling from it leaves a visible trail on the surface below, holding its shape for a second or two before settling back in. That trail is the proof that enough air has been beaten into the eggs to do the work that fat would otherwise have done. Millions of tiny air bubbles, suspended in the egg and sugar, ready to expand in the heat of the oven and give the cake its rise. In wartime, this already demanding technique became harder still. Fresh eggs were rationed, and many households relied on reconstituted dried egg, which whisks less readily and traps air less efficiently than fresh egg does. Achieving the ribbon stage with dried egg required noticeably longer, beating, patient, repetitive work with a hand whisk, often by an arm that had already done a full day's other work before it ever got to the cake. Here is how it was made. Reconstitute the equivalent of 4 eggs from dried egg powder, following the standard ratio of 1 tablespoon of powder to 2 tablespoons of water per egg, whisking each batch smooth before combining. In a large bowl, combine the reconstituted egg with 60 grams of sugar. Begin whisking by hand in most wartime kitchens, since electric mixers were neither common nor always powered reliably. Continue for considerably longer than feels reasonable. With dried egg, expect 10 minutes or more before the mixture pales, thickens, and begins to hold the ribbon shape when the whisk is lifted clear. Sift 100 grams of flour over the top of the foamed egg mixture, a little at a time, folding it in with a large metal spoon using slow, deliberate movements that lift and turn rather than stir. The aim throughout is to lose as little of the trapped air as possible. Once the flour is fully incorporated, pour the batter immediately into a shallow, paper-lined baking tray, spreading it evenly to the edges. Bake in a hot oven, around 200 degrees Celsius, for only 6 to 8 minutes, just long enough for the sponge to set, and begin pulling away slightly from the edges of the tin, no longer. Overbaking is the single greatest risk with a fatless sponge. With no fat to retain moisture, a few extra minutes in the oven is enough to dry the crumb out completely and make it crack rather than bend. The moment it comes out of the oven, Turn it out immediately onto a sheet of paper dusted lightly with sugar. Peel away the baking paper from what is now the top surface. Then, while the sponge is still warm and at its most pliable, roll it up loosely with a clean sheet of paper inside the spiral, simply to teach the cake the shape it will need to hold. Leave it to cool completely in this rolled position. Once cool, unroll carefully. Spread a thin layer of jam across the surface thin, because the sugar in the jam itself was rationed. And a generous spreading was a luxury most households couldn't repeatedly afford, and roll it back up into its final form. That is the fatless sponge, the wartime Swiss roll. Cut a slice and you see a tight spiral, pale and slightly dry-looking compared to a modern version, with a thin, almost modest line of jam running through the center rather than the thick, generous filling that later decades would consider standard. The texture on the tongue confirms what the eye expects: light, slightly spongy, faintly eggy, with none of the moist richness that butter or oil would have given it. It is a cake built almost entirely from air and effort, and it tastes, in a way that is hard to describe except by comparison, exactly like what it is. That austerity was not a flaw to the people who made it. A Swiss roll on the tea table, however thin its filling, was still a Swiss roll, still something with a name, a shape, and an occasion attached to it, made from a few precious eggs and the willingness to stand at a bowl for 10 minutes longer than seemed strictly necessary. There is one British recipe in particular that almost nobody under 60 has ever tasted. It survived 2 world wars and was gone within 5 years of supermarkets arriving. We documented it. It's on this channel.